Hi, this is Lisa Henderson, Editorial Director for Pharmaceutical Executive, and I'm here today with our panel to discuss blazing a path for commercial success in the new normal through digital innovation and acceleration. So let me introduce our esteemed panel. We have Jackie Diogardi, Vice President, Global Commercial IT with AbbVie, Valerie Abrel-Duong, who is Vice President, Customer Engagement, Innovation and Mature Markets IT at Sanofi, and Vyom Bhuta, who is Global Head Commercial Digital Innovation Life Sciences with Cognizant. So thank you all for joining us today. So to kick us off, Vyom, I wanted to ask you, you're with Cognizant, in your role at Cognizant, you work with pharma, biotech, medtech companies. How has the innovation agenda accelerated in life sciences companies?
So Lisa, thank you for having us. Life sciences industry is under a spotlight given the pandemic. At Cognizant, we're extremely proud to be working with leaders like Jackie and Valerie, who are really faced with a dual agenda for innovation. One is to save lives for both COVID and non-COVID patients in the midst of the pandemic. And second is, while they're doing that, to reinvent the business for tomorrow, to really operate in a remote virtual healthcare system. Early in the pandemic, as part of the first response, we saw companies accelerate innovation in terms of coming up with the right diagnostic test for COVID, medical equipment, and now we're seeing an acceleration and a race towards in clinical trials in trying to find the appropriate therapy and vaccines for COVID. What we also are seeing is, while companies are doing this in a very rapid fashion, companies are sort of gearing themselves up and really rethinking and resetting in the ways they operate, not only just internally, but also how they collaborate with others in the healthcare ecosystem, with governments, health systems, patients, payers, to deliver better health outcomes. Some of the specific things that we're seeing from a commercial and medical standpoint are, number one, brand launches came to pretty much a halt. They were stopped. No new products were being launched because the healthcare system was overwhelmed. And now, as things are picking up, we're seeing a more phased approach to launches. So not so much global and national launches, but also just more local launches. And if you think about it, while this was driven by the pandemic, it should be the norm, where micro-targeting, essentially using data and information to mine data about the customers, the characteristics and whether those customers live in, whether it be at a state level, local, county level, and how hospital systems function. That intelligence is vital in creating tactics for launch that are more personalized for that specific area to have a more meaningful outcome. We also saw sales and marketing teams coming together and really coordinating their efforts in how they engage with HCPs using digital channels. Obviously, a lot of the access during the pandemic to HCPs was reduced and hospital systems because of the stay-at-home protocols. So very quickly, the teams got together at life science companies to try and coordinated efforts on digital marketing programs and outreach. We saw the use of technology like Viva Engage and Zoom to be able to interact and reach HCPs to answer their questions and also just relate to their needs in a remote fashion. We saw, however, while there was a quick response, companies are figuring out that really the sales force, to be effective long-term and to operate in a more remote fashion, which really might be the norm, Salesforce had to get retrained in how they appropriately engage remotely with HCPs. We saw some medical device companies actually adopt AR/VR solutions, and they piloted some programs to be able to support hospital systems remotely, and really train staff at hospital systems to be able to diagnose, and operate medical equipment remotely. We also are seeing a good rise in AR/VR technology for field force training. Another area is the medical affairs team had to really ramp up their operations for income, big, huge spike in incoming inquiries from patients and healthcare professionals during the COVID. So obviously they scaled up from a human capital perspective, but we also saw use of digital technology like smart chatbots to be able to effectively triage inquiries and patients appropriately. So really combining human and digital technology to be able to support the patient population during those spikes. And largely, even before the pandemic started, we were seeing a cultural shift in mindset in pharma companies and life science companies adopting a more consumer-oriented mindset. And we saw the evidence of this when new roles were being created by life science companies, like a chief digital officer. And those roles were being actually filled with talent from other industries, more from retail, from high tech. So again, we see that cultural shift towards a more consumer-oriented mindset continue on in hopefully what will be the new norm here soon. And so in many ways, the pandemic really has been an accelerator of innovation for life science companies, and really has left shifted the initiatives on the digital roadmap. And also just executing that in a very agile enterprise.
Thank you, Vyom, for that overview, and that's a lot to talk about. So let's delve into those specific aspects that you covered. And I'm going to ask Jackie, how have customer-facing teams, including sales and marketing, medical affairs, patient services, at AbbVie adapted during the pandemic to continue to meet the needs of patients and healthcare providers?
Yeah, it's actually, it really does kind of build a lot on what Vyom just talked about. I would probably say the first step, which, and I'm sure Valerie will probably echo some of this, is the first step is we kind of had to learn, first of all, how to become a virtual company, right? So that was kind of step one, and technology is obviously is a huge foundational underpinning for that. But I think even the examples Vyom gave is like, we had to learn, like, how are we going to help our sales forces understand how to interact with an HCP in a virtual world. But the first thing is we had to figure out, how are we going to train them? We used to come together to have training and, sales meetings where everyone got together and got face-to-face training, and that just wasn't an option anymore. So there was a lot of work that had to be done to really, I think, amp up our own ability to work really effectively as an internal company, to think about how we're going to approach these tactics. How are we going to reach our HCPs? How do we understand our patients and what they're going through? And then, to be honest, it started with understanding our employees, because each of our employees are also caregivers, patients. We have a lot of HCPs actually internally as well. And I think in some ways that was a great microcosm for us to start to build out some of that digital culture that we had to do. So that was kind of step one, is how do we enable our teams, get them working together, get them effective. I think the second big piece was we just needed to kind of first just get in the water and make sure everyone was okay. So there was definitely I think a moment, I would say, once the pandemic happened. I called it the sprint phase. I think we thought it was going to be a sprint, and everyone was like, all right, we're in, and everyone was running, and we were excited in the sense that we were going to tackle this, and we figured out how to enable teams. How do we get people working together? How do we start to understand the HCP, the specific things we could do right away for patients? We knew patients were losing insurance, so what could we do around helping them with support, patient assistance? We knew our own employees were having spouses and partners who were losing jobs, so what could we do to help support all the change that was happening? And I think we're at a point right now where we're at this pivot now. We know this isn't a sprint anymore. This is going to be a marathon. And I think we recognize that, and I think there's been a step back and almost a moment to say, now let's really understand what are the mid and long-term impacts of what COVID is going to do. And I think it really heightens what Vyom was saying. It starts with, we knew that digital was important. We knew consumerization was important. We knew that we had to be able to really touch people where they needed to be with the right information through the channels they needed. But now it's heightened because all of those channels have had to be turned on so fast, and the reliance on those channels is going up. So I think knowing that, the first thing we're trying to make sure we really do in each of these areas is let's really understand what people need. The one thing we understand when we think about our consumers, when you're a consumer, is that you want things to be received when you want them, how you want them, right? You want it to be personalized. I don't want Zappos sending me men's shoes. I only want women's shoes. I want them to be a size 7.5. I want all of those things. And so I think that is a big part of what we've learned is there probably isn't going to be a one size fits all. So what we've got to understand is how do we have true insights into understanding what do our patients need and what's stopping them. The same thing with our HCPs. And if we think rheumatologists are acting the same way as oncologists, and that a patient who has cancer is acting the same way as someone who has atopic derm or chronic migraine, I think we would be doing a disservice to our patients and to our HCPs. So I think a lot of it is around how do we understand what are they dealing with? What are the barriers that this situation is creating? And then how do we really use that innovative culture of understanding and trying things and to accelerate, I think, that digital insight. But to Vyom's point, technology is a piece of it. And I'm sure Valerie will touch on this too, but technology is an enabler that supports getting the data, helping to get insight, making sure we can deliver in ways. But the glue that holds all those things together are still, it is all the other people in this process. It's understanding, it's our sales teams, our medical teams, our researchers, the healthcare providers that are in the offices. And so we can't forget that the people that connect these ecosystems are just as important, because if we have a great message, but no one can get it, or someone is emotionally in a place where they can't hear it because they're struggling with other pieces in their life, then we are doing a disservice to both, to our patients, right? We're really doing a disservice because we're not getting the right, or we're doing a disservice to our healthcare providers who are trying to support their patients. So I think there's actually been an understanding that this is much bigger and more complicated. And the people part, I don't think, can be underestimated. I think we've invested a lot in the technology. We've enabled digital channels. We've created content that is more piecemeal, that can be managed in ways where people can consume it much easier through channels that are available virtually. But I think the piece that will take longer and that we have to keep focusing on and continue to learn from is going to be how do we support the people in both our sales reps, both our nurse ambassadors, but our patients and our healthcare providers, hospitals who are trying to also figure these components out, doctors' offices, the support staff. How do we connect all those people and help them be successful and just doing their jobs, which is what they want to do, which is providing great healthcare to patients. So a lot of things we've learned, but a lot more to learn. And I think that is probably the lesson for the next 6, 9, 12 months is how do we keep iterating and continuing to learn on how to support the technology and the people in these scenarios.
So what do you think pharma can learn from other industries around innovation? And at Sanofi within IT, what do you look for in talent and the ways of working?
Yes, first, what Vyom and Jackie shared resonates very well with my experience as well in Sanofi. So it's amazing that we all face the similar challenges right now. At the same time, I've been in the business of innovation for many years in different industries. I worked in big brands, consumer packaged good brands, when they were challenged by private labels in the retail industry. I worked in e-commerce when Alibaba and Amazon were starting, and we were figuring out how to work with them. I worked lately on subscription models and personalization to help people on the commodity side, but also on the experience side. And it's true that the pandemic has created a sense of urgency for people to break the silos and work together towards very concrete issues. And we saw many people stepping up and talent also shining because they were working multifunctionally. At the same time, I think that if we are weak before a pandemic, we don't become strong through the pandemic. And it's important that we continue to anticipate, because then we have the tools at our fingertips to activate very easily, and else we become a commodity, or we are weak and we lose. So I think in the business of innovation, it's very important to continuously innovate. And I've seen that across industries, there is a very similar pattern. The first thing is, as you mentioned, Jackie, what are the unmet consumer needs? And we see people and the talent, they need to have empathy. They need to not jump on the technology, but take time to listen to the patient, to the consumer, and really understand what problem we're going to solve. And I didn't find this skill very easily. And it's very different people we have to bring in IT to be able to do this, or work very multifunctional with other functions who bring more consumer insight skills to the party, which I think is essential. So that's the number one. I think the second one for me is to be able to really dare to dream and think out of the box. Sometimes we're so limited by what we have lived in the past or what we believe can happen or not happen, that it's very hard to imagine another world. And the innovators tend to be able to break those silos. So how do we find those people who dare to dream? And the third is indeed to be able to rapidly experiment and test with patients, with consumers, the initial prototypes, and improve them based on their feedback. And there, that's probably where you also bring more hard skills with technology skills, still working with people with empathy to be able to create digital products that make an impact. So it's a very special profile. I don't think everyone can innovate. We have to really attract a certain profile in Sanofi, and I set up an ITS innovation team. We have actually other pockets of innovation ecosystem who are well connected to work as a crowd across the company. And they are able to quickly learn from each other, share and reapply, but also jump as a squad on a particular business problem. The one that inspired me the most is the one we work with the multiple sclerosis business team on how can technology improve the life of MS patients. That was an amazing experience that led to the partnership with AbbVie, but we diverged initially pretty much on the possibilities. We dare to dream, and that opened actually the first initiative in digital therapeutics for Sanofi. And we dare to dream, and that's a new opening. So I think innovation is very essential, and we can't just afford to innovate during a pandemic. We need to be ready, in my opinion.
So Vyom, what role does digital play to uncover the opportunities in customer engagement in chronic specialty oncology and rare diseases? I think Jackie touched on this. You know, you can't talk to one therapeutic area the same way you speak to another, but could you expand on that?
So Lisa, you're absolutely right. And Jackie is absolutely right to point this out, that the treatment, the care pathway for patients with chronic conditions is very different than treating patients with rare disease or patients who have cancer and oncology. However, a common trend we're seeing is a move towards personalization of care. And this really starts with understanding patients in a more intimate way and having a patient-centric mindset. A few years ago, Cognizant did a study called the Healing Study. We had trained anthropologists live with real patients to understand how they heal. There are a couple of things that we learned. One is the journey for patients is not linear. We often, as brand teams and as pharma, we create these patient journey maps that are linear. But what we found is it's actually not. Patients take a few steps forward in healing, and sometimes things work, and sometimes they regress in their healing process. And what patients are looking for are ways to help them adhere to therapy in that journey. And they're sort of looking for these personalized interventions from their HCPs, from pharma companies that can help them through healing. And we saw the respondents actually said that their patients are more likely to adhere to therapy about 3.5 times more if they receive that personalized intervention. What we also heard is when patients measure healing, it's not as we measure through a clinical outcome. While clinical outcomes are important, for patients, it's really the way they measure healing is, are they able to do things in their normal lives? You know, it's a lot of it is based on, do they feel better? And 80% of those patients said that's what's the most important to them. The third thing that we learned is every patient is different. The way what works for you may not be may not be the same as what works for me as a patient. So there's a need for exploration and experimentation in how each individual patient sort of heals. And 47% of the patients said they're actually seeking information and interaction and tools that provide these personalized nudges for experimentation and exploration. Now, if you think about all of this, digital can play a vital role in this when it comes to providing these personalized nudges. In my opinion, pharma needs to think not only about the medicines as their core asset, but also think on how they can make data, software, hardware, and services as their core asset in what they bring to the market. And they don't have to necessarily do it alone. They can really collaborate with partners, with health tech companies, as well as payer organizations and health systems to make this happen. You know, and we're seeing this in healthcare and in life sciences where there's an enormous investment in digital health. And really, when you categorize these investments, the investments are being made to impact 3 dimensions. One is to improve wellness, screening, and prevent disease. Combining, you know, disparate data sets about patient healthcare records and pharma's deep knowledge in clinical trial information to be able to find biomarkers to help identify patients who could be high risk of disease. So how can you really prevent wellness or prevent disease and focus on wellness, and also have good screening mechanisms to identify patients who might be at high risk? So, and digital plays a critical role in being able to do that. The second area of investment is to be able to improve access and effectiveness of therapy. With personalized medicine and diagnostics, digital therapeutics, you know, looking at investments in software as a medical device, and patient support programs are all driving towards improving access and effectiveness of the therapy. And the third dimension, I would say, is improving the experience of care. That's where we're seeing investments in telemedicine within healthcare, but also life sciences companies on how they can participate in this, what we talked about earlier, virtual healthcare system. And also leveraging technology to help patients transition from a hospital setting to care at home. So that's where we're seeing investments in-home care, smart devices and diagnostics to essentially create a at-home care ecosystem to be able to get information about how patients are healing and to provide meaningful information to their care network, whether it be caregivers and also their healthcare provider who's actually treating them. So companies who we think are going to win moving forward are the ones who can embrace digital, create frequent feedback loops with patients, and then use these insights to drive and deliver personalized care.
So, Jackie, your company has ranked very high in reputation and innovation in a couple of reports, including RepTrack and IDEA. So how have you cultivated a culture of innovation and focus on the customer to drive this recognition in the market?
I do think that, this is actually going to build a lot on what Valerie said as well, in terms of how do you think about innovation. And, you know, for me, the start of innovation is really having, in some ways, clear vision and mission and what you're trying to do. I think the one thing, and then Vyom kind of built on that, in that it has to center around the patient. I've been in life sciences my entire career, and I won't say how many years that's been, but it's been a fair number of years. And I actually did a brief stint at the very beginning in telecom. And what I always tell people is, I love what I do, and I think I would work hard no matter what industry it is, but I don't know if I would work as hard if I was making shoes as if I wasn't in a pharma company. And I love shoes. So it's not, you know, but I think we are very lucky in this industry that at AbbVie, we feel very connected to our patients. And the vision of our purpose being here is to drive unprecedented outcomes for patients is, I think, a driving factor for every single employee who comes. And I actually was just on a meeting this morning with our entire global business technology organization, and we had a patient come speak to us. And she told us, I mean, it was virtual, but she told us how debilitating her condition was for 25 years. It started when she was 8. This is a chronic condition. And she was diagnosed 3 years ago. So think about someone who's lived with chronic conditions that they didn't know how to deal with. And when you hear those stories, it is motivating. And it really creates a culture of, you know exactly why you're working this hard and why you need to be innovative, why you need to figure out how to accelerate to speed, why you need to drive to outcomes. And I think that mission vision is critical in a company. I think AbbVie's done a fantastic job at making sure every single person in the organization knows what they're trying to do and who they're trying to impact. And I think as we moved into therapies like oncology, almost everyone knows someone who this has impacted. I mean, I would dare say I've yet to be in a room where I can't say who knows someone who's been impacted by cancer who doesn't raise their hand, right? And when it's that personal and it's that real, I think it becomes, it increases your drive and your motivation, because I think we know those are the things that create a highly productive company that can work together. On the innovation side, I think where we've really been challenging our team and how you keep it going is, I think exactly what Valerie and Vyom have been saying is, you need to break down the silos. If we know we're trying to impact the patient, what you create is this huge sense of, how do we work together to figure out how to attack that enemy? And the enemy is the time it takes for us to get to fantastic outcomes for our patients. Because you know what you're doing now is potentially allowing someone to have another couple years with their mom or their sister, and that could be you one day, or it could be you, or it could be a loved one. And I think that kind of motivation is really inspirational. And so we're lucky there. The innovation part goes back to a little bit, like I said, I'm going to build off what Valerie and Vyom said is, we have to impact the patient. That's the center of our universe. So then what you've got to start to do is unpack, what are the barriers? And so Valerie said it very well. How do we figure out what is stopping people? And Vyom gave some couple of examples of where you can see that. The mission is we impact patients. So any barrier between getting a therapy that's going to impact you, regardless of whether it's access, regardless of whether, to Vyom's point, you're higher risk, and if we can understand it earlier, how do we get the data to help you get to the right services, whether it's you don't have reimbursement, whether you live too far away from a doctor where you can't get the testing you need to even get on a therapy because it needs, 2 types of tests in order to ensure that you're able to get through a prior authorization, or that you have the right, if you have that disease, we need verification before we can do this. That's hugely impactful. And each of those barriers are, what are they? They're opportunities for innovation, right? They're opportunities for cross-functional teams to say, I'm going to think differently about this. I'm not worried about just getting a new therapy. I'm worried about making sure it gets to the patient and it creates the outcome we're expecting. And I think that type of a culture has to be built around, centered around the patient, and two, breaking down those silos, allowing people to say the silo doesn't matter. What matters is I got to figure out that barrier. I'm going to figure out how to work around that or to get over it. To Valerie's point, we're going to dream big on what our impact can be. And I think when you have those things, that's how you create that company reputation to hopefully attract that talent that wants to make that impact. And I dare say, I mean, we just finished our employee giving campaign. And we were talking about this because COVID has been so impactful to so many people. And, AbbVie's done a 2-for-1 match on anything people gave. So, I mean, it was like $21 million or something that was able to be raised. That's the same culture. The culture isn't just something about the patient. We want to be a company that cares. And I think that motivation starts with your patient, but that culture has to be in everything you do, because employees and the people who work there, they're smart, right? People get it when it's not sincere and it doesn't ring true. So when we can't just say we care about our patients, we have to feel it. And starting with patients starts with also caring about the people in the company, how we act, what are the values that we portray. But I think that they've really cracked the nut, and we continue to build that. And with my team, it's the same things. Like, how do we continue to find that focus on what's going to motivate us, both internally to support our people. And the more we support our people, the more capacity they have to work on those innovations to understand how we're going to impact our patient. But I agree wholeheartedly with Valerie and Vyom. Patient in the center, breaking down silos, figuring out the barriers, and then just letting the teams go, knowing they have the power and empowerment to go drive it, I think, is how we've continued to build that reputation. And it's been a fun journey and continues to be.
For Valerie at Sanofi, how do you approach personalization of the customer experience, and what is the right balance between the human and the digital engagement?
I found very inspiring Vyom and Jackie speeches, and I think it tells how much yet have to be done to crack the personalization and make it simpler for the patients to access the treatment, to have the right diagnostic. And I think many of us who joined the pharma industry, who are still learning, we came actually to crack this. And I don't think we have cracked it. We see a lot of energy still to remove barriers. And in my opinion, it's the ultimate grail. That's what we are all, waking up in the morning, or many of us. Some are innovating drugs for sure, but then others are really trying to think, how can we make it easier for the patient and for the customer? And frankly, I'm going to be humble. I don't think we cracked it. We are experimenting, we are learning, we want to go there, we analyze, but we are at the very beginning of the journey. And I have no doubt that in the next 2 to 3 years, there will be tremendous progress in this area. Where I see we are making very good progress in our company is first on the user, so internal. As you mentioned, Jackie, actually also answering the first question, already trying to make the user's life easier, personalize what they need, and not get lost sometimes in systems, find the contract you have to sign. Which tool was it again? So we created an app, Approve, where actually you have everything you need to do on one app, and we kind of hide the complexity of the back office, or embrace new tools to make it simpler, or use AI ML to augment the human beings to make decisions faster and not get lost in 600 reports where you get somewhere all the data you need to make a decisions, which kind of is the things we did in IT in the early 2000, right? The more reports, the better. And some of those legacy are still around. So why is it not just one dashboard for an individual to know what they have to do, the famous control room, or where you have highlights? And that's where personally I've experimented a lot, but not yet cracked it fully, I must admit. So I'm actually super inspired by the possibilities and the journey we have yet ahead of us in this space. And I found very inspiring. So thank you so much, Vyom and Jackie, for your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. Lisa, if I may, I want to just add on to a point. You know, pharma and life science companies have actually been very personal, in my opinion, in terms of the personalization model. Why do I say that? Is because the interaction model, at least with HCPs, has been very much face-to-face.
One-on-one, right?
One-on-one. I mean, that is as personal as you can get.
Right.
Right? So the reps are out there. They know the HCPs intimately, not clinically, what they think, what kind of patients they're getting in, you know, what type of preferences that they have. Are they early adopters, or do they look for KOLs influence to then adopt their prescribing behaviors and so forth? So reps had this information through personal interactions, right? So highly personal model. Everything that we talked about for the last, 40 minutes or so is like the virtualization of healthcare, right? The personalization of care we talked about. So we talked about two things: virtualization of healthcare, personalization. The trick is, how do you combine personalization in a virtual environment, right? So through digital means, if a lot of the promotion now is going to be, and even before the pandemic, it was going to, reps' access to doctors and health systems are being reduced. Probably in the new normal, we might see an uptake from the lockdown, but it's still going to be, I think, a lot lower than what we were enjoying before, where health systems and so forth. So now, how do you get that same level of information about your customer, whether it be HCP, and now we've added patients into the fold as well. But let's say HCP promotion, how do you continue to know who that doctor is? What is their prescribing behavior? What is their inflow of patient? What is that patient segmentation look like for that specific doctor and within the health system? In markets where you have that data available, you can actually do that digitally through data analysis, machine learning, and so forth, to try and say, try and get that insight about the behavior of that HCP. So again, accelerating personalization in a virtual environment is really the code that Valerie was talking about that needs to be cracked, right? And I think the consumer-centric mindset, the talent equation that we just talked about on how consumers, like Jackie talked about getting shoes, and she loves shoes, and she probably searches and buys on Amazon, Google, and so forth. But, Zappos and Neiman Marcus, if they're still around, they can track Jackie's behavior and can tailor to her need. How can you bring that same mindset in a more healthcare setting in the context of pharma and life sciences?
Yeah, and Vyom, I would add one other thing is that, and I think you're right, because our healthcare in general we like it to be personal. We want to talk to our doctor. We don't want to have everything be. So I think there is an aspect of how do we make virtual feel personal?
Yeah.
Right. So there's an aspect, and I think, Valerie, this goes back to how do you make it simple, but it feels like someone's talking to you, with you, you're engaged, right? And I think a lot of times we think that virtual or digital means impersonal. And when it comes to our healthcare, we don't want impersonal, right? The expectation is that it is very personal, right? These are important decisions that could not be not just science-based, but are very emotional. For both healthcare providers who want to do the right thing for their patients, as well as for patients themselves and their caregivers. So these are very personal decisions. And so I think there's an aspect of how do you make something that is virtual or digital feel personal and make people feel cared for. And then there's, I think, a second piece, which I think both touched on, that I think is an important, maybe just augment to the discussion, is And to do that, it's no longer just about our relationship, meaning a pharma company and an HCP, or a pharma and a patient. The ecosystem and the things that touch you are way bigger. So this idea that we're going to have all these other, and I think Valerie mentioned it with the silos. The silos, we often think of internal silos, like what are the functional silos we have to break through. But in healthcare, I think we understand the silos are everywhere, right? The silos are between how do you get information from your HCP to a healthcare provider. We have patients, we have reimbursement and insurance that might be a different place. We have, pharmacies that may or may not be connected. We have labs that do lab work, but they may or may not be also connected to our doctor's offices. I mean, how many times have I moved where I've literally gone and said, I want my entire, electronic health information so I can bring it to the next state that I move to make sure that they have all that information. So I think the other piece is the silos in healthcare are big and they're in many places. But so the silos we have to break through are really, who do we partner with? And I think both of this has been mentioned between Valerie and Vyom. Who do we partner with to start to create that simple experience that Valerie wants to give for people, right? You don't create simplicity by not working with everyone. So we no longer can be so siloed in our thinking and who we want to partner with as well. So, to Vyom's point, if you've got to go and get a diagnostic test, is that a group we now need to partner with? Because to make the journey and the process simple for our patients, we need to. Well, that's not something that pharma necessarily did previously. You kind of think of within your world. And so being able to do like the digital therapy that Valerie pointed out in Sanofi, that took a very different type of partnership that probably, they hadn't done before. So that's the type of partners, I think, and the gray that happens now, because in order to really create that great experience, that gray needs to be traversed, and it's between us and many other groups. It's not just pharma companies anymore.
Or new models emerging. We see some of those right now with verticalization.
Yeah.
So indeed, not to have to work in an ecosystem well connected, but to own the full value chain. And that's the earlier question of similar things that happen in other industries. This is something that is happening also to some extent right now in healthcare. We see a platform like Forer. So verticalization. And why? Because indeed, if you own the data and the value chain at every level, then indeed you can serve the patient holistically and not have them trying to figure out how to navigate in the ecosystem. So there is really a lot to learn as well in life science, because I don't think it's in the DNA necessarily of big pharma companies to own potentially the full value chain. It is in the DNA to have partnership. So that's probably why we go there first. Yeah. But then it will be interesting to see, and we see some of them going into the full value chain with diabetes in particular.
Well, and there's new companies that are in healthcare now that are, we have Google Health, you have Apple, you have Alphabet, you have technology companies that are bringing a very different way of, and so the opportunities are also very different. So to Valerie's point, we are not constrained, I don't think, anymore by what you can dream, but it isn't unusual for us to dream about those things because it's so out of our wheelhouse. So there does take a certain amount of pushing. I think that constraint of maybe our own thinking, I think, in order to say, well, what other possibilities are there?
I think Valerie's point around verticalization is a fantastic one. And rightfully so, she focuses on innovation. But if you look at new entrants that Jackie's talking about, right? Google, Amazon, some of the startups, Livongo Health and so forth, they're taking a particular disease state and trying to verticalize, as Valerie talked about, right? Verticalize in terms of end to end. Can they help across the journey, so to speak, right? In pharma, the reason why towards that way is because our commercial model, sales and revenue model really started with a patient being diagnosed and then competing for which therapy is best, right? And that's where the revenue model starts. Well, if you start going and expanding the services and verticalization, now you got to think, okay, how does it impact our existing revenue model? Hopefully it helps in some way. But if you want to innovate, you got to first not think about revenue models, think about more the patient, again, the patient-centric mindset. So some of the things, I'll give you examples, and just couple of examples is, with Amazon, when you order, they completely own that channel, right? The entire distribution, ordering, payments, even what our likes and interests are, recommendations on what might be best for us by understanding who we are. If you take a similar mindset through an app ecosystem or consumer ecosystem, you could start to think about how can pharma create an app or a platform or service architecture, essentially, to be able to get information about me as a consumer, as a potential patient who is at high risk, collect information. So start that engagement now, right? Through for a particular disease state, using genomics and so forth, and engage in a relationship there. So I can provide information at the same time. I can learn more about potentially disease state, what can cause risk, what lifestyle behavior changes I need to make. Engage earlier on, right? Even before I'm diagnosed. Through that same app ecosystem, can you now help schedule visits to doctors appropriately, right? Should there be a role of pharma or not? But if you really think about the way Valerie is thinking about on verticalization, yes, because you want to care for the patient. So if you can help schedule appointments, schedule lab work, get lab results, and to be able to see it by partnering with others in the ecosystem, but creating that one interface where the patient is interacting, now you're starting to, and then obviously later on in terms of adherence and so forth, that we're already playing a role in that. There are a bunch of adherence apps out there. Yeah. But those are, the verticalization concept is a really good one that Valerie brought up.
Well, and I think longitudinal data is also really important, because I think, and Valerie, I'd be interested to see as you talk through some of these things, because I think it used to be, and even when you think about buying shoes, it tends to be transactionally based, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I need to buy a pair of tennis shoes, so that's what I'm looking for, and that's what they're going to feed me. But really now in healthcare, what you're talking about is you want to understand it's the entire lifespan of a patient potentially, right? And because we need to, in complex therapies and complex disease states, you're talking about comorbidities and you're talking about other components. So it is a much more full picture of a patient, and you're really trying to understand potentially through their life. It's not just at a point in time, especially in chronic conditions, right? Mm-hmm. And what are the things may change? So think about what that could mean. Like, do you think about conditions that maybe get exacerbated with stress? Do you have more stress when you become a parent? I would say yes. You know what I mean? But how do you think about that from a creating that, both the data and understanding, to then help patients as they go through those journeys? So going back to Vyom's point and Valerie's point, like, if you know that, think about how you can engage to help patients have better outcomes now, because you're not just talking about here, take your treatment, make sure you get it. It's also, hey, I'm seeing that, some piece of data from your Fitbit or something is showing your heart rate's elevated. Hey, you may want to, so those are the lifestyle. What are the other pieces that you're more susceptible to something? And I'm going to try and help, because that is something that we want to understand about the patient in its entirety. So I think there's so many opportunities. It's kind of almost unlimited, to Valerie's point. I think we're scratching the surface, right, of the possibilities, but it's a really longitudinal data, and what's available is something we'll have to really think about, while thinking of privacy and other things too, obviously. So,
and that's why the investments in digital health initiatives and a lot of the pharma companies to try and make this happen. So.
We've talked a lot about the future, about technologies, obviously the digital health outcomes, and where we are as an industry, as Valerie and Jackie just said, just scratching the surface of these initiatives. But I think I'd be remiss if I didn't ask and touch on, a societal issue right now, because diversity is an important topic in our society. So, and you're both executives in high-level pharma companies. So as executives and as leaders, how have you approached diversity and inclusion in building and managing your teams within the IT organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think I received a lot in this space in my career from leaders, and since a while I decided to give back, as probably I turn a phase in my career where it's now or never, right, to give back to others. I focus primarily on gender diversity, but I'm also very interested in diversity in style and diversity also in from a geographic standpoint, from origins. I think it's very important as a global leader. I see myself as a global citizen to have people in my team who are coming from all the continents and help people from all the continents grow and aspire to be an IT leader in the company. Now, on gender diversity, I think that what I've observed is if we reach 30%, that's when we get the tipping point. Yeah. So the question is, how do you get there? And at Sanofi, we were below, and in previous experiences as well. So it has to come with some special effort. And in my opinion, there are two big ones. The first one, you need to get an impulse from the top. And actually, about a year ago, we had our new CEO, Paul Hudson, joining the company, and he did his first speech to the place where I was. And he almost took me to tears when he talked about diversity and inclusion. You could see that he really feels it, believes it. And he actually then role modeled by hiring half of his ex-com from outside as women. You know, so he didn't just talk about it, but he did it, which sometimes you see people talking about it, but they don't do it. So being congruent and giving the impulse are for me the number one success story when you want to drive change. And then I think the second one is when women support women. I think we can, of course, it's great to have men supporting women, women supporting men in their development. But when you manage to get this group united, I think it works very well. And last year, I decided to talk about 30 of us to the Women in Tech conference in Amsterdam, and that was really brilliant. The content was very inspiring. Actually, I was blown away by the quality of this conference, and I used this opportunity to advertise. They tried to do it virtually this year in mid-November, and it's going to be global. But we came back inspired and united. And we can see the impact already on the numbers. But most importantly, as you go through restructuring permanently, right, in big organizations, and especially in IT, as we continuously need to reinvent ourselves, it's very important that you can trust other women and support each other through the transformation. So this is the second one, in my opinion. Impulse from the top and role modeling, walking the talk, being congruent from the leaders, and then second, a woman supporting women. What do you think, Jackie?
Yeah, those are great insights, Valerie, and I think probably every woman in IT has had some path, or we've hit some things. I agree, and I think I kind of think of it as tool, because I think we're in a very technical field, which also means that you know, so you think about STEM, you see less women. I'm also fairly focused on, I think, racial equality, in the sense that we know we have underrepresentation, especially in this field, with both, with really having, I think, Latin as well as African-American or Black colleagues globally. And so what we've seen is that the numbers are very small. And so I agree with Valerie. I've actually seen gender, we actually do fairly well at getting females in, but what I'm not seeing them is always at the senior levels. So I think we're trying to unpack that and understand that a little bit more. And I think there's a couple of ways to make sure you're doing that. And I think so I think we have to do it both for racial as well as for gender, especially in technology. And then I think life sciences in general, because it is so science-based, I think we see some similar trends that come through. One of the big concerns, though, I say, as Valerie said, it's not just getting them in, but are we seeing them in their careers rise to the senior positions? And so I think that's a really important one, because we actually see quite a few women at junior levels, but we're not always seeing them then at senior levels, which then implies something's happening right between those phases of career. And then I think we just have an underrepresentation racially, I think, across. And so that's something we're also needing to work on. And I think there's a couple of things that I first feel like we're at a kind of a really interesting time where people, I think similar to Valerie, a huge commitment from senior leadership, from companies, and a lot of discussion about it, not just internally, but externally with partners. Like Valerie said, there's conferences, there's people getting together and learning from each other, both cross industry and cross organization. And I think that's really important, because if there's nothing can accelerate our learning more than seeing what other people are doing and seeing if it's working, building on top of their innovation, which I think, because and there's a lot of innovative things that people are doing, which is fantastic as well. And then to Valerie's point, it's global. So it's not the same in every country. So you also have to think, racial inequality in the US, we're seeing different marginalized groups that may exist in different countries, let's say in New Zealand or in Australia or in Singapore, so you have to also put on a personalization similar to what we talked about, is what's unique for that country or that area, that there still may be underrepresented groups, right? And we have to understand how we help those. And so it's not necessarily one size fits all, but some of the same things can happen. But I think the big unpack for me is that previously, as we were going through, I think, our careers, and I'd be interested in maybe Valerie and Lisa, you too, is that I think I always felt like inclusion and diversity meant we want women to be in, to be there, and we want to have an equal number, but we are going to judge you in a very specific way against what we think is value. And so what I think the big pivot for me has been, it felt like I could be successful, but in order to be successful, I had to be a very specific way. And I think what has really been the turn for me, I think in the last 5 years, 10 years, is that it's more of a, how do we allow people to bring their unique skills and value them the same? You can be a different type of leader. You can be, and I think that is really the diversity part, right? We're all allowed to be unique, but we can be valued. And that there doesn't have to be one way. But I do think within our systemic processes, I think how we do performance, I think how we value leadership qualities, I think we need to be really thoughtful. And I think as leaders, especially, is when we judge people, are we judging them equally for what they bring? Or do we have preconceived notions and biases that make us value certain things more than others? Not on the outcome, but on how work is done. And I think that is a really hard, and there's a lot of science to it, right? We know that we create shortcuts in our brain, and that is very helpful when you don't have to think about biking because your brain knows what to do, but our unconscious biases are strong. And, women judge other women through those same biases, and we judge, it's everyone has these biases. And so I think there needs to be more work done to really be accountable for recognizing when we have those, and then holding each other accountable, not because we're trying to do something wrong as much as you're doing it without thinking. Our brain works that way. So how do we recognize it? But once we know it, then you have to take deliberate action to do something different. And so I think many of the things we've done so far within AbbVie and externally, and I think AbbVie has done many things that I'm very proud of, but I think we're at a pivot point where we're recognizing and we're really putting a lot of energy into, and I think me as a leader, I'm 100% bought in on this, is if we just continue to do the same things, an object in motion will continue to move in that direction, right? If we want it to change and we want that outcome to be different, we're a part of the system, right? We're a part of it. And so similar to Valley, women need to support women. We got to figure out in our system, what can we do differently and deliberately differently to change the trajectory of where that object is going so it ends up where we want. And so I think for me that we have to focus on those underrepresented groups, and we have to think about the biases that probably created the lack of diversity in those areas, and how do we start to unpack those. And I think it's the second part, which is in how do we unpack along the career path, because we seem to be seeing a lot less in senior positions than we are in junior positions. And so we don't want just people, we just don't want diversity, we want diversity at every level, right? And I think that's really important as well.
First of all, it's really inspiring to hear Jackie and Valerie speak about this, right? And it's inspiring in a couple of ways. Number one, I think going back to the title of this conversation that we've been having, if you want to care for the patients and HCPs and customers, you need diversity of thought within internal organization, right? And that diversity has to come, gender, race, geography, in all aspects of diversity. So I think that is number one, which is to do our jobs well, we need diversity of thought. Second, I think from Cognizant's standpoint, we're doing a lot of things from an organizational standpoint. Jackie's has been to some of our events, but we also support women in tech, which Jackie, pointed out. It absolutely is a big thing. We're a technology-oriented company, and so that's a big mission of Cognizant, to make sure that we have diversity in the technology space. So we continue to do that. But more of a personal level, I'm a father of two daughters, 14 and 9, and it's leaders like Jackie and Valerie and you, Lisa, who are in our field, trying to make an impact, talking about this, raising awareness, being leaders and making an impact within the organization. And obviously the leadership roles that you have had is really incredible. And that, which is really important, because I'm hoping that my daughters, who are 14 and 9, when they are ready to join the workforce, we're not talking about this. It's second nature, right? So the diversity is not a topic that we're talking about to the extent that we're talking on now, because it's accepted, it's the norm. So really, it's obviously inspiring to hear about that. And I'm glad you asked that question, Lisa, because it kind of brings it all together into everything that we were talking about for the last hour.
I think it's good that Vyom dare to dream, but I think we need to continue be vigilant to create an inclusive environment, especially in crisis or pandemic times. We tend to go back to what we know. It's kind of taking us back to what I think I said similarly. I think we need to manage diversity and inclusion almost as an innovation.
Yeah.
And unless we are strong coming into the crisis, we're going to be even weaker afterwards. So we have to be very resilient through the process, not to go back to what we know. But the companies which are already diverse, I'm sure they'll be even stronger afterwards. I'm pretty convinced.
When you don't have diverse companies that are in those spaces, you also don't see diversity in the types of therapies that come out too, right? And we've seen that in clinical trials, and so there's a big push there. But that's another side, or it's not a side, it's a byproduct that is really impactful to everybody though, right? So as pharma companies and places in life sciences, I think that's really critical as well. Think about women's health, and we know there's underrepresentation of investment in women's health, and so there's things like that too that I think the byproducts are really important to understand if we don't have diverse companies that are making the medicines or making the therapies.